Now, last week, I referred to the Great Revolution. You can call it the urban revolution or just the revolution. It's an overwhelming set of events that took place over the last 2 centuries that have totally and absolutely transformed our lives. I mean, it's impossible for us to know how our lives have been transformed because we cannot even imagine what life was like before plumbing, before electricity, before big city. I mean, it's almost inconceivable. This revolution, whether you call it the urban revolution, the industrial revolution, the post-industrial revolution, totally transformed the lives of millions and millions and billions of people on this planet. Primarily the lives of people who lived in Europe and in North America. But now it's moving all over the world. And one of the consequences of this revolution is something that we are now trying to cope with. It's called globalization. It's true that we are Americans, but actually most of the forces now controlling our lives are not in America. At one time we thought, and I remember that I grew up that way, I live in the most powerful country in the world. And in fact, it's a vast country. On each side is an ocean. And we Americans are in control and in charge of our destiny. That's it. So, and we're certainly in charge of our economy. Well, that's an illusion. The United States of America is part of what I call this global revolution. And for a while in this global revolution, we certainly could imagine that we were in charge. But now we have to look at what it means to live in a world that Marshall McLuhan described as a global village, all right? So, we have a global economy. The leading powers and forces in our economy, the corporations, no longer are national. They may claim to be national, but they're not, because they will go anywhere in the world, right, to find the workforce that they need. We have a global market. So it's not true that General Motors is planning to produce mainly for the American market in its desperation. It's imagining that there are millions and millions and millions of Chinese, I hope they build the roads, that there are millions and millions and millions of Chinese who will buy those products. And in fact, in Japan, when they manufacture cars, they're not imagining they're going to sell most of their cars in Japan. So there is a global market. There is global labor. When corporations look at the world of labor, they no longer say American, non-American, they say expensive, cheap. And they go where it is cheap. So there's a global workforce. When a corporation now looks at labor, it doesn't just look at the United States of America. It looks at the what? At the whole world, and you've got your pick. You go where it's cheapest. There is global knowledge. At one time, I think people in Europe thought that they were the masters of science. That's where science sort of began, all right? And the scientific revolution began, and in fact, most of the scientists were Europeans, and then Europeans moved to North America, and then what? Well, science was North American, but I mean, it's all part of European culture. I want you to know that science is enormously rude. It refuses to become the possession of any one group. It can what? It can be transferred. So certainly in the 21st century, in East Asia, with all its PhDs in science, they may have far more than we do, right? Knowledge is not transportable. That wasn't true at one time. When we lived in what we call the age of faith, knowledge was confined to faith systems. But science is international. It transcends faith boundaries. It just goes anywhere in the world, and it takes its consequence, the new technology, with it. We have essentially a world culture emerging, which started to some degree in North America and Europe, but it's all over the place. Is English simply the language of England? I mean, if you're a tourist in China, they besiege you. They want to practice their what? They want to practice their English, and in fact, new varieties of English are emerging. There's Chinese English, there's Indian English. No, we had Scottish. No, do you understand? It's a world, it's a global, it's not simply England's language. It now belongs to the world, and if you use the internet anywhere in the world, you better be somewhat proficient in English. So, and in a sense, we have a world population, because today people will move to places of economic opportunity. So all you have to do is look at the United States of America. At one time, it was filled with Anglo-Saxons. Most of the Amerindians were killed off, so it's mainly filled with Anglo-Saxons. And imported African slaves. And then they came by the millions, right? Today, it's not true that you only move within your country. Today, it is very clear that many of our children and grandchildren, or great-grandchildren, will not live in the United States of America. They will have to find work and employment, in other countries. You've got a workforce that's just what? It's just moving. It's a world population. It just keeps moving. And we can see what happens. I mean, we need immigrants in order to do the menial work. We complain about it all the time, but they have to come in. Who else will clean the house? So that's fine. And then we've got older people, like myself, who are now into the leisure culture, and now you want to move to a nice climate. Well, Florida is going to fall into the sea because the weight of the people in South Florida is absolutely overwhelming. So the next thing you know is that affluent people in the United States are going to go to the islands, aren't they? The Caribbean, and then Mexico. I mean, do you understand? They're just going to move because the transportation is just going to be easier, and all of a sudden, you got all these people moving. National boundaries are, to a large degree, irrelevant. If you have the money, you can move as an affluent person. If you don't have much money, you try to go to a place where you can get a job, which most likely is not your own country, if you come from the third world. Now, this new global world has some very striking problems. First, obviously, from the national perspective, is the role of corporations, which are no longer patriotic. And we in Detroit know that. So the problem is how to persuade them to invest in your place. It's no longer clear that we can persuade the great corporations that started in Detroit to invest here. I'm still grateful they sponsor the symphony and the Michigan Opera Theater for I don't know for how long, but I mean I'm glad that at least they're putting some of that money here. And then, of course, There's the problem of labor because it's very traumatic. I will talk more about it when I review The World is Flat by Tom Friedman. I mean, here you are. You've got a nice job working in a factory. You can now afford to put your kids through college. You've got 2 cars and 2 garage doors to accommodate the 2 cars. You have a month's vacation, do you understand, guaranteed to you. And the next thing you know is that the auto supplier that you're working for is now bankrupt. So now comes an adjustment. Now, obviously, the economist tells you, well, you have to understand, this is the flow in the new global economy. The flow is that it shifts. Sometimes the wealthy are in America, then the wealthy move to China. There's kind of, it sort of shifts, and you'll have to adjust. Well, it's traumatic. If you're adjusted to certain levels of affluence, going down is much harder than if you're adjusted to suffering. And possibly, moving up. One of the problems, obviously, are vanishing cultures. Today in the world, I don't know, there may be about 500 significant languages spoken by what I would say fairly substantial populations. It is most likely the case that within 100 years, most of them will disappear. Most of the world will be speaking English, maybe French. Oh, Chirac is hoping French. Certainly Spanish. Most likely Arabic and Chinese. There are going to be these languages around. But in a global world, most of what we call the unique cultures are going to vanish. We can see that. Because wherever you travel now around the world, you spend a lot of money and it becomes less quaint. You're staying at the Ramada Inn, where all the people walking in, native or tourists, are wearing T-shirts and jeans. And one of the problems, and that's the thing that we're experiencing now, couldn't this prosperity have lasted maybe for a couple centuries so we could, get a chance? Is the rapid change. The change technologically is overwhelming, and every major technological change disrupts our lives. But one of the greatest consequences of globalization is the dichotomy. The dichotomy between the people in the world who've made it and the people in the world who haven't. 250 years ago, most of the people in the world, almost all the people in the world, whether they were in Asia or Europe, were, by modern standards, poor. They were either at subsistence or barely above it. That is no longer true. We now have a world in which, certainly, in most of North America and in most of Western Europe, and certainly in Japan, you have people with incomes that are somewhere around, the per capita income, somewhere around $27,000, $28,000. And then you have places in the world where people make less than $1 a day. Got it? I'm just trying to, are you getting this picture? That dichotomy did not exist before globalization. Poverty was shared by, do you want to know? Poverty was shared by everybody. There are just a few people that didn't fall into this category, and all nations and all cultures. But if you go to Malawi in Africa, and then you visit Southern California, Any resemblance between the two is purely coincidental. There is this extreme range. This extreme range. So let me try to talk about the dichotomy. You can divide the 6 billion people of the world. I'm rounding the figures. There are over 6 billion. 6,186,300,000. I'm going to make it 6. Is that all right? Okay, I'm going to make it 6 billion. All right. There are 6 billion people in the world. And there are 4 groups. 1 billion people are what we call rich. And although we in Detroit are now experiencing the beginnings of a significant and major recession compared to most of the people in the world, given our standard of living, we are rich. And in that rich category, generally, are the people in North America, meaning the United States and Canada. And we're talking about most of the people in Western and Central Europe. They're certainly in this category. And throw in Japan. And there are now places in China, in Shanghai and Beijing, where certainly those people would be included. And then throw in Australia and New Zealand, where the settlers are mainly of European descent. I mean, that's it. And they are living a lifestyle that we live. Some live it very well, and some live it less well. Doesn't make any difference. It includes incredible technology. It includes longevity. We have access to both sanitation and medicines that will keep us going most likely beyond 100. It is do you understand? It's an absolute revolution. The phenomenon of very affluent societies, that group, that 1 billion people, is senior citizens. It's not a major phenomenon in poor cultures because people die young. So now, and it's a world filled with things that used to be regarded as luxuries and now are regarded as necessities. Vacation. Is a vacation a luxury? No. It's an absolute necessity, isn't it? And in fact, we have amenities that appear. One of the things we notice when we become rich is stress. We notice it. And then we need stress relief. So now there's this whole industry of people we can go talk to. Try to imagine in Malawi people asking for the shrink. You just tried. It's an industry that only fits us. We are affluent cultures, can allow large numbers of people to devote their time to luxury concerns, majoring in French literature, dabbling in English literature. Do you understand? I mean, it's so hard for us to understand where we are because we're in the middle of it. And isn't everybody living that way? The second group is what we call the middling group. And the middling group has about 2.5 billion people in it. The middling group are people who are above subsistence level. They most likely have their own house or they share a house with another family or whatever else it is. They most likely can afford to buy a scooter or maybe even a motorbike. They're not driving an SUV. I mean, no, they can afford to do that. They most likely have a job which doesn't enable them to have a vacation, but which enables them to feed their children and make sure that they get some kind of elementary education. I mean, they're not poor. They're middling. And in fact, their lifestyle resembles the lifestyle that some of us may remember that people in America were in back in the 20s and the 30s, before the age of affluence arrived. And now the middling people are all over. They're in Mexico. Mexico is now, large parts of it, certainly northern Mexico, are in what we call the middling. You can go to Chile. They are what? Middling. You can go to large parts of southern Brazil. They are middling. You can go to the coast of China, and they are overwhelmingly middling. I've seen China move through three phases. The first phase was the pedestrian phase. Second was bicycles. The third, I hated it, motorbikes. You can just see as they move up, and now it's the beginning, because GM is serious, and so are the Japanese automakers. It will be the automobile. So that's about 2.5 billion people. So now there's another group, the third group. The third group consists of about 1.5 billion people. They're called poor. By poor, it means that they live above the subsistence level, but just what? Barely. They've got a hut, and they've got food, and they may be growing enough food, you understand, for themselves, and they may be able to grow just a little more, just a little extra, which they might be able to sell. In fact, the poor category includes many of those people in India who at one time were extremely poor. But India in the 70s and 80s underwent an agricultural revolution whereby the technology of the West, the development of these new grains, which doubled, tripled, and quadrupled the yield of an acre, now arrived in India. And in fact, for many of the very, very poor farmers living in the villages, their yield now increased, and their lifestyle improved just beyond subsistence. And you find them, by the way, certainly all over Asia. In South Asia, if you are in China and you go into the interior, I mean, not Guilin. I mean, you really go, you're tramping through the interior. Then you will find the poor. On the coast, there are the rich and the middling. In the interior, there are the poor. In South India, you will find lots of people middling and rich. In North India, you'll find lots of poor. And then there's the last category. That's 1 billion. It's equal to the number of people who are the rich. It's 1/6 of humanity. They are the extremely poor. Extremely poor means that you are making less, or the equivalent of less than $1 a day. Got it? And in fact, these are the people who are living just at subsistence, and in many cases below what would be regarded as subsistence. Their lives would, from our point of view, if we experienced it in North America, be regarded as desperate. When we talk about poverty in the United States of America often, so you go down into Detroit. I know there's crime and whatever, but they've got houses. Do they have houses? They got a house, and maybe a long distance to get to the grocery store, but they got a what? They got a grocery store. Some of them certainly have employment, and in fact, the school system doesn't work very well. But there's a what? I mean, no, there's a school system. So many of these people are in middling, and many of these people are in what we call poor, but they're not in extreme poverty. For extreme poverty, you have to go and visit parts of the world which you may see in pictures. Sub-Saharan Africa. You go to Malawi. You go to Zimbabwe. You go to Zambia. You go to the Congo. You go to parts of Tanzania and Kenya. You go to parts of Nigeria. Go to Ghana or Togo or Benin. I've been to some of these places. And what you experience is, do you understand? What's in Detroit is not, by comparison, poverty. It's extreme poverty, meaning that it is impossible for the people to pick themselves up and go up. What has often happened in these areas is that it has gone, while most of the world is going up into middling or rich, and while the poor seem to be holding, I mean, their condition has improved, the extreme poor are going down. In fact, the average income of most of the people in sub-Saharan Africa has gone down over the last 40 years, not up. Now, the condition of the extreme poor is 1 billion people whose lifestyle we cannot, do you understand, really imagine. So it's aggravated by the conditions under which they live. They are isolated, meaning that even if they made something, there is no road to take it out of their, do you understand? They could have a terrific product. There's no way to get it out of their village, even if they could make it. And there's no way to bring most of the stuff in. The only thing that would work in their village is a cell phone. Because you don't need wires, right? The whole thing, and they could talk to somebody on the outside if they could afford one. There is no infrastructure. By infrastructure, I mean there are no places you can go to established by a government that can offer you really aid or assistance. And in fact, the no infrastructure, I mean, there are no bridges, and there are no functionaries. There's no investment. GM, Daimler Chrysler, whatever it is, looking for cheap labor, would never what? Go there. Why would they go there? The labor that is available is below menial. It's uneducated. And in fact, access to the place is what? Impossible. I mean, they would have to build all the what? All the infrastructure. There's no sanitation that we know of. That is, waste matter is what? all over the place. It flows, there are ditches, by the way. You can see it, and often the places that contain water are filthy. I still remember, you can still see if you're a tourist, even if you go to Bangkok, those klongs, those canals, they wash, they drink, I don't know. No, they defecate, they wash, they drink, it's all the same, it's all the same water. I mean, I live in a world in which people don't give me tap water. So we're all drinking we're little babies, we're all drinking out of bottles. Because after all, germs, the enemy. I mean, it's a world that's almost inconceivable to us. 1 billion people. And because of it, disease is rampant. They don't even have, so you live in sub-Saharan Africa, and there are all these mosquitoes. Well, rich people can buy mosquito netting, and they don't get stung by or bitten by the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes carry malaria. So now these are parts of the world where malaria is absolutely rampant. It's almost unavoidable. They have lectured the mosquitoes over and over again. But they insist on biting them. And the disease is aggravated by diseases that flow simply from the only pleasurable activity left to these people. It's called sex. What flows from that activity is a disease transmitted by sexual intercourse called AIDS. In some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, 1 out of every 4 people or 1 out of every 3 people, and in some areas in Malawi, 1 out of every 2 people has AIDS. So it's a world in which there are hundreds of thousands, millions of children whose parents have died. I'm just trying to. It's a world without fertilizers. So if you've got soil like the southern Ukraine or Iowa, then maybe it's okay. But even I know you've got to have crop rotation. What did I know from crop rotation? I used to always shop in a grocery store. What do I know from crop rotation? But so it's there's crop rotation. Otherwise you will what? Eat up the nutrients of the soil, and then your soil will be useless. So many of these people in overcrowded villages have land that is now useless. Before, by the way, when we lived in the early agricultural world, what people did was that they would farm a little stretch. It's clear and burn, they would burn the whole thing. And then when they used it up, they would just move over to what? Another little stretch, because there was all this land. You can't do that anymore. Because you can't move over. There's another village over there. No fertilizers. It's a world with no education. There are no schools. In these little isolated villages, there are no schools and there are no teachers. Is there education? Yes, well, parents historically have always what? Educated their children, and grandparents educate their children, but they don't receive any education that would enable them to function basically even in menial work in an industrial society so that somebody would invest. They can't read or write. That's why we have the public school system. We're an industrial culture. One of the basic skills required by business for hiring labor is that they can read and write. There's no birth control. I mean, if you have sick humor, You can say, well, it all balances out. AIDS, no, that's the sick joke. I once was in South Africa, and I went to Paarl, and I stayed in one of those Dutch Afrikaner little villas, hotels, overseen by a strong Afrikaner woman. And we were sitting down at dinner because they served dinner in it. And she says, well, I'm not concerned about the future of South Africa, she said, because the blacks will simply die of AIDS. I had to leave. She said that. That'll solve, do you understand? That'll solve the black problem. They'll all what? They'll die. Oh. Well, but I mean, the point is that there are all these children being born into a society that doesn't possess the resources to feed them or even to train them so that somebody would invest in them. There's no specialization. Now, I referred to this in terms of the original farm culture. When you live in a little village like that, there's no specialization. You got to build your hut, you got to take care of your children, you got to grow your grain, you have to be able to do everything. Right? That isn't true in our society. I'm very good at certain things and I can dial, or I can bunk, 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 whenever I need help, because I'm special. Do you understand? I am specialized. And in fact, what specialization produces is efficiency. You become very good at a what? At a single task, and as you get more and more specialization, you get more and more efficiency. That is, an economy in which one person can do everything means that he doesn't do anything that well. So there's no specialization. And there's no saving. Whatever you grow, you consume. And what you grow is not enough. So there's nothing to save. Maybe you can buy a plow. Maybe you can buy a cell. I mean, whatever it be. There's no saving. After all, our economy started before we entered the consumer culture with a vengeance. Our economy started with people, as the agricultural wealth increased, people saved. And then they took that wealth and invested it, right? You can't rise if there's no saving. There's no possibility of saving. Whatever food you've got, whatever you've got, you use up almost immediately. It's like the hunting culture. So, in the year 2000, a meeting was held at the UN, and in fact, representatives of 147 countries came. The rich, the middling, the poor, and the extremely poor. There are 180 members of the United Nations. When they came to this meeting, and the United Nations called this meeting the Millennium Meeting, because it was 2000. And now the whole idea was to look into the future of this global economy and this global world. And in fact, a proposal was made, which became the Millennium Project. The Millennium Project was, first and above all, a project to eliminate by 2025 in the world extreme poverty. Got it? We're not talking about making everybody rich. All right? To eliminate extreme poverty. Now, everybody signed it, all 147 nations. They had other resolutions, but the main focus was on extreme poverty. There are 1 billion people in extreme poverty. And in fact, that's dangerous, because we know that one of the most unstable parts of the world is sub-Saharan Africa and The other place of extreme poverty is South Asia, Cambodia, Bangladesh, right? Those are places of extreme poverty to eliminate extreme poverty. And there was great enthusiasm for the whole idea, and Kofi Annan was not then experiencing the trouble that he is now as the Secretary General. But from the moment the conference was over, well, now there was the Millennium Project. There were all these challenges. These nations have met before, and they have made the same resolutions. Do you understand? I mean, year after year after year after year, that yes, this is a scandal, this is an outrage, all this suffering, all this extreme poverty, it ought to be eliminated. All people ought to talk nice to all other people. There seems, historically, that was one of the major challenges, to be no motivation. So you hear the story and everyone's, oh, that's terrible. Oh, that's horrible. Oh, how do they live that way? I can't stand it. And then they switch to the next channel. It certainly includes me. It may include other people in this room, right? What's the motivation? Why should I take from my resources? I already have charged more than I can pay for on my credit card. How do I respond? What's my motivation? Think of all the dreadful things in the world, and we say, oh, that's terrible. And then nothing happens. One of the challenges, of course, was it was sponsored by the United Nations, and there are people in this country who what? Oh, they hate the United Nations. You mentioned the United Nations to Tom DeLay. You just say those two words. Those are fighting words. It's a corrupt organization. It's an organization that will take away the autonomy of the United States. I mean, you can't even say the United Nations. The third is the skepticism. You know, after you say, oh, it's terrible, then some of the rational people come in and say, you're talking about 1 billion people in extreme poverty, and you hope to solve this problem by 2020. What are you talking about? They don't have sanitation, they don't have fertilizer, they don't have any of this thing. So what are you talking about? Plus, all those sub-Saharan countries and Bangladesh and Cambodia have these corrupt governments. Give them money, they'll end up in the what? In the hands of the officials at the top. We've had that experience time after time. And then there are those people who simply say, it's insurmountable. Thinking about it gives me a headache. I'm sorry that it exists. And the insurmountable people say the following. We have to wait. In time, the labor in China will be more costly. Right? It's inevitable. And the labor in India will be more costly. And the labor in Mexico will be more costly. So in the end, if you're looking for cheap labor, the only place you can go will be Africa, and maybe in 80 years. We'll go to Africa because that's where the what? That's where the cheap labor will be, so they'll just have to wait. Now, the answer to wait is a very comfortable answer for people who are affluent. But for people who are desperately poor, whose parents are dying of disease, who have no jobs and no education, then the word wait. But last, and somebody said this to me the other day, he said, look, you're talking to Detroiters, or metropolitan Detroiters. We are in a major crisis. If you're asking our government to do something right now, don't ask them to do something about world poverty. Ask them to talk about Detroit poverty, an economy that's what? Falling apart. So why are you dragging in this other issue? Well, there is a young man, not as young as he used to be, but from my perspective, there is a young man who disagrees with those responses. He's very famous. He has been labeled one of the 100 most important people in the world. And it wasn't written by his mother. This was an objective article. His name is Jeffery Sachs. And he was chosen by Kofi Annan to be the director of the Millennium Project. Do you understand? This project that was voted on by these 147 nations with no budget at this meeting in the year 2000. He was already famous when he was chosen. He was in the process of being chosen the leader of a new institute at Columbia University, which is supposed to address the issue of how to arrange in the world for sustainable living on the part of most of the people in the third world. It's called the Earth Institute, a mixture of economics and environment. He was also for many years a professor of economics at Harvard University. He was in his late 20s when he got appointed. Pretty good, because a lot of people I know in their late 20s are trying to figure out what they're going to do with the rest of their life. And in fact, as this wonder boy, he turned out to be an economic advisor to many nations who were in economic trouble. In the middle of the 1980s, he went to Bolivia, where he became an economic consultant, and in fact, he helped Bolivia for a while come out of its economic disaster, which was hyperinflation. He was an advisor to the Polish government. He went there after 1989. Poland was the first of the Soviet satellites to break with the Soviet Union. He went to be an advisor on how to turn the economy around from being a communist economy to being a successful free enterprise economy. And it was fairly successful with the advice he gave. He became, in 1991 and 92, the advisor to the former Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, called him up. Jeff, get here. He'd already developed a reputation, and he was now going to remake the Russian economy. His advice on the whole was rejected. He gave it, and I think he was paid for it, but the politics of Russia were so complex that more than half of his advice was never taken, and in fact the Russian economy never recovered in the way that the Polish economy recovered. And he now, as a result of this fame, became the economist you want to call in the world when you have a problem. The additional thing about him was that he was raised in Detroit. And he is the son of a very prominent labor lawyer in this city who recently died. His name is Ted Sachs, and he and Jeffrey, they're two kids, and Jeffrey is Ted Sachs' son. So he comes out of Detroit. And his book, in response to this whole issue, is called, it's a rather bold title, The End of Poverty. The end? And in fact, the book and he made the cover of Time magazine in the middle of March. And in fact, Paul Wolfowitz, who's not known as a liberal, who has now been appointed to be the head of the World Bank, read his book and said it makes a lot of sense. And Jeffery Sachs proposes to carry out the project of the Millennium Meeting. And he says it's not an insurmountable problem. In fact, it's a problem that could be fairly easily solved if there was some willingness on the part of the rich world to do something. Now, in order to understand what Sachs is proposing, I have to give you, because he does it in his book, the history of the most troubled part of what we call the world of extreme poverty. We're focusing not on group 3, we're focusing on group 4, the 1 billion people making less than $1 a day, afflicted by all the ills that I have described to you. Is it possible to take these 1 billion people in 10 to 20 years and remove them from the category of extremely poor and just move them to what? Right? Wouldn't be bad. And move them to poor. Because the people who are poor have entered in some way into what we call the global economy. These people are outside the global economy. Is it possible? Well, his main focus is on sub-Saharan Africa. He talks about Bangladesh, he talks about Cambodia, and so forth. The main focus is on sub-Saharan Africa. So let's look at sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, for most of its history, before the arrival of European conquerors, was a place where the overwhelming majority of the people, I mean everybody, was engaged in some form of agriculture or herding. And they lived in small villages, and they were divided up into clans and tribes, and at the head of each tribe there was somebody called the chief, who was treated generally with great reverence and possessed great power. Most of these villages were on what we call the edge of subsistence. But what Jeffery Sachs points out is that they most likely were better off then. That's not true of us in the rich world. They were better off then than they are now. That is, they lived in stable villages where, yes, there was a high mortality rate. They didn't have modern medicine. But they had stable families. Children were raised by their parents. They were trained or educated in agricultural things and how to build a house or a hut or whatever by their parents. They had supportive villages. They may have gone to war from time to time against neighbors. Warfare was part of African history as it is part of European history. Right? But it was a fairly stable environment, and the extreme poverty that now exists, that's interesting, did not exist. And then what happened was the Europeans arrived. The Europeans arrived in the form of the Portuguese and the British and the French. And they disrupted this society because what they wanted from Africa initially were slaves. And that disrupted the economy because now it was possible for some Africans to get rich, some chiefs. What they now did was they organized their own villages into little armies. And then they went out all over the countryside and they raided other villages. They burned them, and sometimes they killed the other chiefs, and then they took the men, women, and children and sold them to the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Swedes, the Danes, all engaged in the slave trade. So now there is a total, you understand? The intrusion of the Europeans now changes the whole economic picture. Large areas are devastated. And now we have names of kingdoms because some of these chiefs now, receiving all this loot and money from the British and the French and the Portuguese, now lorded over large areas and established kingdoms. There's a famous kingdom called the Kingdom of Benin. Well, in what today is Nigeria. Well, Benin was built on slaves. So everything is disrupted. And in fact, the old economy now begins to collapse. There are all these desperate people. The villages, in many cases, are destroyed, and now there's counterattack. The people who are attacked in turn organize, and then they attack. And then the Europeans decide not to simply get slaves. The Europeans arrive, and they decide to occupy the territory. It is not clear when they occupy all of sub-Saharan Africa and divide it up into its own little states or colonies that they know exactly what they're looking for. Is there any economic benefit to them? Slavery is abolished by the middle of the 19th century, so they can't formally have slaves. But now they're in areas where they're looking for some kind of product. So what they decide to do is to look for things that can be grown. They're looking for gold and silver. They find a few diamonds. Not bad. But they're looking for gold and silver, so now they have to think of agriculture. How do they use these people, who they still view in many cases as slaves? You can't use the word, by the way. Now a no, politically incorrect word. Whom they view as slaves, and now they want to grow. So the Ivory Coast. I live on the Ivory Coast. They produce the foundation of one of the secrets of happiness in my life. Chocolate. Oh, what would I do without chocolate? How would I survive? I mean, I try not to think of how the chocolate got there. I mean, the whole thing, but there it is. So now what you do is, you're French and you're in the Ivory Coast, you tell the people, stop growing food. You're going to plant cacao. Do you understand? Well, you can't eat, but you need you're living.
My twin brother David was killed in a car accident in rural Wisconsin and was instantly brain dead. And our family got a phone call probably about an hour after it happened. We had talked about organ donation. Actually, my brother was the one that had brought it up. Knowing that those were his wishes, it wasn't scary. It wasn't a big deal. It just seemed like the right thing to do. So it was sort of like the most fitting tribute that, you know, his death, the final comment wasn't his death. It was that, you know, it was life. It was life affirming.
You're going to plant cacao. Do you understand? Well, you can't eat. But you need you're living at subsistence. So if you take the land away from food and you now plant it for export. So in Belgium and France, they produce these wonderful what? Chocolates. And most people didn't think of how it was acquired. So now you take land that could be used for food. I mean, it happened in Egypt and the Sudan with the British. They told the people there isn't much land even to grow food. And they said, don't grow food, grow cotton. Because we need cotton for the mills. And since the people were treated as slaves, most of the profit that came from it went to the what? To the occupiers. Meanwhile, the whole agricultural economy is disrupted and disturbed. They're not even growing. That's how they fall below subsistence. Before, they never saw an automobile, and they didn't see a gun, whatever, right? Before, they lived in their little village, and they were able to subsist. We would have called them poor, but not extremely poor. Now, the source of their agricultural survival is destroyed. So they fall, now they're falling below. Do you understand? They're falling below where they are. And now, what happens is, families begin to collapse. And now what you find are gangs. Young men, I mean, they can't stay in the village anymore. Do you understand? They find other young men, and now they roam the what? Roam the area, and they assault, and they pillage, and they steal, and whatever. The social order begins to collapse. So the arrival of the British, the French, the Portuguese doesn't improve. For the British, the French, and the Portuguese, whatever wealth they extract from Africa will help to raise their standard of living. But for the people who are there, it's depressing. And in fact, they fall into extreme poverty. Well, in the 1960s, because of the Cold War, the Western powers decide to stop colonialism so that these people won't turn to the Soviet Union. So now Charles de Gaulle started the whole thing, 1960s. He says to the people in Mali, you're independent. Oh, we are? He says to Niger, you're independent. Oh, my God. He says to the Ivory Coast, you're independent. Oh, well, that's right. Well, their economies are hopelessly attached to what? The Europeans. Their agricultural world has been totally disrupted. And in fact, their families and social, do you understand, internal social structures have collapsed. And so now, coming out of the gangs are the chiefs who take over these countries. They are the military rulers, right? They've got gang mentalities. So, they now have their hand out, and they say, look how desperately poor we are, and look how wonderfully rich you are. So what we're going to do is give us some money. So indeed, some money is given by European powers and the United States of America, and also money is given or lent by banks that are connected to the UN system called the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. Got it? And all this money, some of it may have been billions of dollars, now falls into the hands of what? The crooks. And almost none of it seeps down or trickles down to the people below. And in fact, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, shows up and says to the crooks, look, you borrowed all this money, you have to pay it back. So whatever resources there are, do you understand, are now taken from the people, whatever there is, and now you've got to pay it back to the big banks that are in New York or in Frankfurt or whatever else it is, because the crook won't get any more money if he doesn't pay some of it back. And it's a very unstable system because you've got this gang mentality. And in fact, there's another gang waiting on the outside to overthrow the what? The leader of the present gang. So he's removed. And there you get the story of independence. And it's all aggravated by something else. The boundaries of the states that were drawn by the British and the French and the Portuguese do not correspond in any way, shape, and form to any of the tribes or nations that are in Africa. We have it right now. You opened up the paper, there's a country called Togo. I was there. Togo is this long, thin country. Is there a people called the Togolese? Well, that's like saying, are there any Oaklanders? Oakland County is a rectangle created by, do you understand? The state of Michigan. And in it are people of what? Diverse backgrounds. So Togo was initially created by the Germans, and then it was taken over by the French. And the boundary was drawn by the colonial powers. Every colony was going to have access to the sea. It's like the farms in Detroit, the long, thin farms. And then they, all the way up to what we call the watershed, you got your territory. Well, in Togo, there are 3 major nations. And the man who most likely was elected illegally, elected in quotation marks, Gnassingbé, comes from the northernmost nation. And the people in the south have no representation in the government. So the Awe are all rising up. They're throwing stones, the whole thing. It isn't an internal war among the Togolese. It's a national war between 2 nations who are stuck in the same country, desperately poor. It's a mess. No. Of course you can say, well, these people are just, you know, violent. You know, you get I want to tell you that. Or these people are simply sexually obsessed. That's why they do sex all the time. That's why they have, you know, you hear these things. And that becomes the reason for doing absolutely nothing. In addition, the gang mentality of the governments produces enormous corruption. And if you are a foreign investor, why would you go to any of these countries? No money has been invested in roads or bridges or whatever. I mean, you couldn't even get out the manufacturing if you wanted to. And nothing's been invested in schools so that the labor is at the minimal level that you need for menial work. And the countries are loaded with debt. Why would you invest in a country which can't pay its debts? So I do want to say that many people looking at the Millennium Project have said, it ain't going to work. Got it? This place, whoever is responsible, it doesn't make any difference. Whoever is responsible, the damage is so great. The social structure is so corrupted. The culture is so uncooperative that basically it's pouring money into nowhere. It's just a what? It's a waste of money, because it will all end up in the wrong hands. It has time after time after time. All we can do is wait. Oh, wait. Remember that wait? In time, I don't know, 100 years from now, corporations will find this to be desirable, cheap labor, and will what? Move in. Meanwhile, there's nothing we can do. But Jeffery Sachs, and that's why the book, by the way, aroused such interest. Jeffery Sachs says, no, we've got to act now, and I have a proposal that is feasible, not a dream proposal, that will work. If you want to find out what that proposal is, come back in 5 minutes. And now, let me turn to the proposal that has excited thousands and thousands of people around the world and has turned Jeffery Sachs again into a celebrity star. Let me just say, prior to giving you his answer, that Jeffery Sachs is coming to town. He's a famous man. He's not easy to get, but he's coming to the Birmingham Temple, which is on 12-Mile Road between Inkster and Middlebelt, this coming Thursday. In fact, there are flyers on the table at the rear, which you may have missed. And he is speaking in the late afternoon. He cannot stay for the evening at 3:30 in the afternoon. So it is an opportunity to hear one of the most important people in the world, and you shouldn't miss it. So it's Thursday, May 5th, all right, in the afternoon at 3:30 at the Birmingham Temple. And if you want to help yourself to a flyer, there are flyers on the table at the rear. So it's Cinco de Mayo. It's the Independence Day of Mexico. No, whatever you want to. All right. Now, let's look at some of the realities. And these are the realities that Jeffery Sachs acknowledges and recognizes. He says, yes, there is corruption, and it most likely will not be eliminated. Got it? He admits that. There are corrupt governments. And getting all those gangs out of power, what? I mean, it's not realistic, so yes. There are cultural problems. I mean, if you're talking about the AIDS epidemic, which has decimated the population in sub-Saharan Africa, one of the reasons is that men refuse to wear condoms. It goes against their macho culture. And in fact, the only way to conquer AIDS there is you have to either persuade or supervise men to make sure that they use them. Because women, their wives, and their children are all victims. So that's a cultural thing. That's not simply the poverty thing. It certainly has a consequence of increased poverty. The family structure in what we call this extreme poverty world has been terribly damaged, which means it's worse than it was before the industrial age. Did you understand? The Europeans arrived. So I just want to read to you an experience he had in Malawi, because in fact that experience was one of the things that turned him on to assuming the project and pursuing it and writing the book. All right. The presence of death in Unthandire, the little village, has been overwhelming in recent years. The grandmothers whom we meet are guardians for their orphaned grandchildren. Each woman has her own story of how her sons and daughters have died, leaving her to bear the burden of raising and providing for 5 or 10, sometimes 15 orphaned grandchildren. These women have reached an age where in more prosperous places they would be the revered matriarchs enjoying a well-earned rest from a lifetime of toil. They would have been even in the pre-industrial times. But there is no break now, no chance for even a moment's respite, because the grandmothers of this village and countless others like it know that if they let up for a moment, these young children will die. The margin of survival is extraordinarily narrow. Sometimes it closes entirely. One woman we meet in front of her mud hut has 15 orphan grandchildren, as shown in photograph 1. There's the photographs. As she begins to explain her situation to us, she first points to the withered crops that have died in the fields next to her hut. Her small plot, perhaps a half of an acre, a half of a hectare, a little more than an acre in all, would be too small to feed her family even if the rains had been plentiful. The problems of small farm size and drought are compounded by yet another problem. The soil nutrients. Oh. Don't believe this thing. Yes, I will. Thank you. I'll speak to that person later. Anyway. He or she will hear from me. Anyway. All right. The problems of small farm size and drought are compounded by yet another problem. The soil nutrients have been depleted so significantly in this part of Malawi that crop yields reach only about 1 ton of maize per hectare with good rains, compared with 3 tons per hectare that would be typical of healthy soils. A half a ton of grain from a half-hectare field would not be sufficient for proper nutrition and would provide precious little of any market income, meaning even if her farm worked, she doesn't have enough food to feed her family. This year, because of the drought, she will get almost nothing. She reaches into her apron and pulls out a handful of semi-rotten, bug-infested millet, which will be the basis for the gruel she will prepare for the meal that evening. It will be one meal the children have that day. I ask her about the health of the children. She points to a child of about 4 and says that the small girl contracted malaria the week before. The woman had carried her grandchild on her back for the 10 kilometers or so to the local hospital. When they got there, there was no quinine, the anti-malarial medicine, available that day. With the child in high fever, the grandmother and grandchild were sent home and told to return the next day. In a small miracle, when they returned the next day after another 10-kilometer trek, and they're all isolated, right? The quinine had come in and the child responded to treatment and survived. It was a close call, though. When malaria is untreated over the course of a day or two, a child may slip into cerebral malaria, followed by coma and then death. More than 1 million African children, and perhaps as many as 3 million, succumb to malaria each year. This horrific catastrophe occurs despite the fact that the disease is partly preventable through the use of bed nets and other environmental controls that do not reach the impoverished villages of Malawi and most of the rest of the continent, and completely treatable. There is simply no conceivable excuse for this disease to be taking millions of lives every year. But nobody gives a damn, including the government of Malawi. Okay? So, there's desperation. The governments, by the way, are sometimes unable to do anything even if they want to, because they've been instructed by the International Monetary Fund that if they don't, who obviously have been instructed by the big banks, if they don't pay back the debt, there'll be no more money. So whatever resources there are, it goes to pay the what? The debt. Now, it is highly unlikely that you can rescue these people by turning them into industrial workers, as in China, right? I mean, you don't have workers who work in factories, and you don't have an infrastructure, do you understand, that could be built for industrial use. The only way to rescue these people is to put them back where they were. Rescue their villages, restore their families, let them have enough what? Food from the land they've got. That's how you get them from extreme poverty just to what? Just to poverty. That's the goal. And in fact, if you want to prepare them for the future in any way, shape, or form, for the global market, When cheap labor finally, arrives in Africa, they're going to need a school. It can be a one-room schoolhouse. They need a school. And they need mosquito nets. And they need somebody to come in and dig appropriate ditches for sanitation and to clean up the water. In addition, they need open markets. Last week I spoke of what's happened in America. Our farmers are indeed subsidized, so that there is a difference between the price, for all practical purposes, they receive for their farm products and what it sells on the open market. So, if these people grow anything so that maybe they could have a little extra and that they could sell it and they could get it out from their village because somebody builds a little road, then they can't compete with the price, because the price of the grain that comes from Europe or North America or whatever is so low because it's subsidized, they can't even sell. So closed markets affects them. And I must say, one of the realities, which is very clear, is we're living in a very unstable world. The major coping tool of poor people is religion. This is a very religious society. It's the main coping tool they have. So if you want to spread fundamentalism, around the world, then you don't pay attention to this. Because if we don't pay attention to it, in a world where at least they're aware of how other people live, then what you're doing is these people will turn to a coping strategy that works. Whether it's Muslim fundamentalism or Christian fundamentalism, and there's enough war already in Africa. And the increase of fundamentalism in our society or in our world provides a great danger to us. So Jeffery Sachs' proposal is the following. I'm asking from each of the developed countries, that's United States, Canada, Britain, Germany, the first group called the rich group. I'm asking from them 0.7%, 0.7% of the gross national product. Which basically, if you've got $10, I'm asking for 7 cents. Got it? I'm asking for 7 cents from $10. And if I take all these nations and put them together, what I can get, most likely, from them, if they're willing to do this, is somewhere close to $200 billion annually. Right? So we're not saying give us $2 out of your 10. We're asking for what? With 7 cents, he says, what we can do, and quite frankly, this is the Millennium Project of the UN, and there are many agencies of the UN that work. What doesn't work is the Security Council and the Assembly. What does work are all these agencies helping children, do you understand, helping farmers, whatever. These agencies work, so they become the administrators, and the aid is not given to the government. The aid is given directly to the villages. Now, obviously, the government has to be involved. You're entering their country, so you have to make some kind of a deal with them. But the aid is given to the village. So you take the money and you buy mosquito netting. You take the money and you dig the ditches. You take the money and you build a one-room schoolhouse. You take the money and you build a road. It's decentralized. It isn't aid given to the government of Mali or whatever, of Malawi, and who then says, oh yes, we'll take care of these people. You go beyond them, and in fact, the condition for receiving the aid is that the money is given in that way. And the last is, and that's indeed what happened in Bolivia. Bolivia would never have come out of its crisis. It said to its creditors, we have a choice between rescuing our people and paying back your money. Right now, we cannot pay your money back. And in fact, they ultimately negotiated a virtual cancellation of the debt. So, I mean, the question Jeffery Sachs asks is, what is more important? Paying back every cent that was lent and may have been maladministered, who knows what, or the welfare of the people who can never have their lives improved unless in some way that debt is canceled. And what he's recommending is that these nations, whether it be Bangladesh or Cambodia or Malawi or whatever, take a tougher stance, saying, look, we'll never get out of this extreme poverty, which is dangerous to you, unless we can start from scratch. Well, people say, oh, that's going to ruin your credit rating. On the contrary, no, if they get rid of their debt, their credit rating will improve. All right. So those are the items. And what he says is it's feasible. I'm not asking, do you understand, for something unreasonable. If there's the will, it will happen. And in fact, he says, in the villages, there is the will to do something. If only, they just need some kind of help. We've given help historically to corporations. We give help to the middle class. We do all this help. They just need some help. And in fact, let me read to you from the book. All right, put it down. Oh, there it is. Let me read to you from this book about a village in Kenya that's visited by him. And I found this to be rather interesting. I canvassed the group on the material conditions of the community and received very perceptive accounts of the grim situation. The community is farming on tiny plots, often no more than 1/10 of a hectare, with soils that are utterly exhausted of nutrients and therefore biologically unable to produce an adequate crop. The soils are so depleted of nutrients and organic matter that even if the rains are good, with yields of around 1 ton of maize per hectare, the households still go hungry. If the rains fail, the households face the risk of death from immunosuppression because of severe undernutrition. Stunting, meaning low height for one's age, is widespread, a sign of the pervasive and chronic undernutrition of the children. The real shocker came with my follow-up question. How many farmers had used fertilizers in the past? Every hand in the room went up. Farmer after farmer described how the price of fertilizer was now out of reach, and now their current impoverishment left them unable to purchase what they had used in the past. A 50-kilo bag of diammonium phosphate fertilizer sells for around 2,000 Kenyan shillings, $25 American. At $500 a ton, that is at least twice the world market price. A proper application might require 2 to 4 bags per hectare, or $50 to $100 per hectare, a cost vastly beyond what the household can afford. Credits to buy fertilizer are neither available nor prudent for these farmers. A single failed crop season, an untimely episode of malaria, or some other calamity can push a household that has taken on debt into a spiral of unending indebtedness and destitution. So, sure, we'd love to buy. What do you think we're dumb farmers? We don't know about fertilizers? Sure we do. If you're willing, do you understand, to give us the fertilizer even at a very low price that we could sustain, we will what? We'll take it, we'll use it. And of course, the final part of the proposal is, if we're going to alleviate extreme poverty, we have to have a fair playing field in which agricultural products are what? Not subsidized. I mean, that's what part of the proposal, meaning if they're not subsidized, then it will be possible for these people to produce surplus and to what? To sell it on the open market. There will be an international market. They will enter into the global economy for the first time. Well, why, Jeffrey, I'm getting a little too personal, why, Jeffrey, should we take your proposal? And the answers he gives are fairly clear. One, it will enhance stability in the world, because otherwise we're going to have religious wars second to none if we do not address the problem of extreme poverty. Two, it will be an act of reconciliation between the first world and the third world. You know, we're trying to find a way, because this is a global economy, and the hatreds between the very rich and those who what? Are very poor are sometimes very intense. One of the ways to bridge it, in the end it will be good for our political situation, our economy, is to do something. It may produce cheaper food for us. And in the long run, if we integrate these people into the global economy, they will in the long run also provide not only cheap labor. If they become labor, they will have money, and in the long run they'll be able to buy the products that are produced by the United States of America and Europe. And the final argument is very simple. It's not an argument used in what we call pragmatic discussions. It's called morality. We have a moral, I mean, I hate to bring it up because it's like, you know, what are you going to do with that? We have a moral obligation to respond to this economic outrage. We don't have a moral obligation to bankrupt ourselves or to destroy our economy. What he is saying is, it is possible to raise these people from the level of extreme poverty to poverty with 7 cents out of $10. So, how do I feel about it? Well, I mean, the negative side of the proposal is, I mean, that it will be impossible not to deal with the corrupt governments. All right? And that's what people keep saying. In fact, in the New York Times review, the reviewer said, oh, well, yeah, the direct aid to the village. But even he, at the end, says, I don't care if all of the aid doesn't get there. If half of it, do you understand? If half of it does, it will do the job over a longer period of time. But nobody else has an answer beyond cynicism. Oh, it won't work, the whole thing. Well, there are millions and millions and millions of people in danger. They have fallen below where they were 5 centuries. Do you understand? 5 centuries. They're below, they're not at the level. And in fact, I was enthusiastic about the book. That's why I wrote a letter to Jeffery Sachs inviting him to come, and because I was very impressed by his proposal. The proposal is not pie in the sky. Do you understand? If there's a willingness, there is a feasibility to it, and if in some way we can address this issue of extreme poverty, then it will indicate that the United States of America has finally discovered that we are part of this global, got it? This global world, and these people are part of our global society of which we are a part. So please read the book, and please come to hear Jeffery Sachs, and thank you very, very much.